We've been on a little bit of a journey the last several weeks looking at church history and kind of trying to figure out from where we've come, trying to figure out why we're where we are today, and how is it that we are dealing with some of the issues that we need to be talking about as a congregation. I'm going to take a little bit of a diversion this morning. I showed you this chart. And this was kind of the basis of our discussion over the last couple of weeks. How we talked about how the Roman Catholic Church came about and how it was really kind of predicted. Remember the passage we read about how it was predicted that this would happen? Remember where that was? Acts 20, and what was the prediction? Paul warned.
Drift away and basically following after the faithful men.
Yeah, the time is going to come when the bishops, the elders, are going to become the source of an apostasy, essentially. And that's happening. And it happened even in the first century. And we saw how that kind of created this wave of the first major apostasy, which still exists today, in the Roman Catholic Church. And then we went through that and we looked at the Protestant movement, which was protesting the Catholic Church, which is why it's called the Protestant Reformation. And that had to do with Luther and Calvin. And we looked at, as you see on this chart, a lot of the different churches, denominations that came from that beginning. And so we look today and we see today, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the World Bible Encyclopedia says there are 33,000 plus denominations. So a lot of different denominations, but in a lot of ways they come from the same source. I want to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, if you want to turn over there, because I want to show you something interesting. You've probably thought about this before, maybe not put it in this context. But we talked about in Acts 20 where God predicted the seeds of the organizational structure and what eventually became, I think, the Catholic Church, and the thinking that we needed to have some sort of major church, all the churches collected together, and we had to think, as I mentioned last week, corporately. But I want to show you a couple of passages that are interesting. I think it predicts the seeds of denominationalism, denominational thinking. And so what does 1 Corinthians 1:1 and 2 say? Somebody read that for me.
Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ with the will of God, and so to these our brothers, to the church of God which is at Corinth, to those who are sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints, of all who are in every place called in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, both theirs and ours.
And then it goes on to say, grace be unto you and peace from our God, our Father, and from the Lord Jesus Christ. So who is this written to? Okay, I want to make a point here, and we're going to talk about this later because we are going to talk about the name of the church and what was it called here? Church of God. We don't see it called the Corinth Church of Christ. I just want to underscore that. It's called the Church of God, and it's called the Church of God 13 times in the book of Corinth, which is interesting. We'll talk about that. But this was written to a specific local congregation. Now slide down, if you would, Barry, to verse 10.
Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment.
So was that a command to the church universal, or was that a command to the local church? Now, see, we might have a tendency to extrapolate it to the church universal, but that's not what this passage is talking about, right? We may say, well, that was a microcosm of what all of the churches should be together. This passage is not saying that. Is it? No, this church is saying, you at Mandeville need to be united. You need to be of one mind and of one judgment. And I already made the point a couple of weeks ago that it's my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but it's my opinion from the readings of Stone and Campbell, that which is at the foundation, basically, of where we came from, the Churches of Christ and Christian Church and Disciples of Christ came from. The point that I made was I think they misunderstood Jesus' prayer for unity. When Jesus prayed for unity, he prayed that his disciples would be unified. He didn't pray that all of the churches be unified. And their concept was more like all the churches need to be unified. I made that point a couple of weeks ago. You may or may not agree with that, but that's how I see it. I think they were denominational in their thinking because they came out of denominational churches. As we're going to talk about as we move into this period of history of the Restoration movement. But here, at least in this passage, he's talking about that local congregation being united, right? That was his desire, that was his wish. What was causing the division? Well, apparently there were a lot of things going on in Corinth that needed to be dealt with, just like there might be things going on here that we need to deal with, and so at some point. So the book of Corinth is a really good way of looking at how to deal with problems in a local church. You with me? And frankly, I don't care what goes on at St. Tammany or North Point or MacDill Avenue in Tampa, Florida, those churches. That's not our concern, certainly as elders. Our concern is, and hopefully your concern is, what goes on here, and that we're united, and that we're one, based on this concept. All right, so slide down to chapter 3. Yes. Okay, sure.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
What you're saying there. So, as part of that prayer 17, 20 and 21, he says, I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their works, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you.
Absolutely. You think that he's talking about the church universal, that they would all be united?
Well, the way I read that is not only for those specific disciples, but for those who believe because of the word of the disciples. I don't know if it's...
Okay. That's certainly another way of looking at it, and as I said, I think that's the way Stone and Campbell saw it, and I'm okay with that. I just don't know how in the world that could happen. I don't know how that could happen.
I pray for congregations that I've been a part of now and everybody throughout the world. I think when we're united, it's not about our meeting time and about our, what we're
specific.
All the specifics of the materialistic, physical thing is being united in the Word that God has given to us through Jesus Christ and through the Holy Spirit.
Okay, and we're going to explore this discussion later, if you don't mind. We're going to explore it because I think if we misdefine it, and that's my concern, if we misdefine it, we talk about things that you're talking about. Remember the example I used last week of the guy that wanted all of the churches to study the same books?
Right.
So that when he went to California on Sunday morning on the 14th of June, he could study lesson 3 just like they would be studying it in Tampa.
Making it corporate.
Exactly.
Yeah, so when I say that, I don't want to give the wrong message how I feel, but I think that we all need, I think we have, it's a good thing to pray for those who are teaching throughout the whole world.
Absolutely.
And to be united in what the Word is saying, but not to the point where, you have to study the same lesson.
Absolutely. And the point that I was trying to make about that, actually, Mark, back when we talked about it before, and I really want to continue to make now, is I think that's the way those founding fathers looked at it. When I read their writings and what they were hoping for, they were hoping that churches would have all the same names, that churches would be studying all the same things, that they would all have the same doctrines. Yeah, I think so. So I'm okay with that. I'm just giving my personal opinion about John. I think it was probably more the idea of individuals getting along, but that's okay. We'll talk about what that looks like and how that can happen. But the point that I want to make is at least now we're in 1 Corinthians 1, and I think we all agree that this passage is talking about that church, right? It's making a local, it's having a local directive that they need to be of one mind and one spirit. Okay, so slide down to chapter 3, and I'll show you where their divisions were coming from. Chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. Barry, you did such a great job. Why don't you read that one?
For when one says, I am Paul, and another, I am Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos? The ministers through whom you believe, as the Lord gave to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase.
So have you ever thought about that passage in this context? Remember what the word to denominate means? It means to name. It literally means to name. You know what they were doing? I'm of Apollos. I'm a Paulite. One of the things that we'll see in the Restoration movement is that those who followed Campbell, because Campbell and Stone weren't always together, those who followed Campbell's ideas were called Campbellites, and those who followed Stone's ideas were called Stonites. Isn't that exactly what this is talking about? And what it's saying is, rather than denominating, you need to get along. In your local group, you need to get along, be of one mind and one spirit. Now, here's my caveat. But not at any cost. Sometimes division is necessary, isn't it? And so we read 1 Corinthians 5, and what were we told in 1 Corinthians 5 that the church was to do when they came together because of this man who was living with his father's wife? Deliver him to Satan. Mark him, however you want to look at that passage. But the idea was identify the sin and recognize the fact that you can't have sin in your midst. Sometimes you've got to separate that out. You got to get the leaven out. So it's not unity at any cost. In fact, the passage some people kind of read right over and forget about is passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Turn over to chapter 11. And somebody read for me verse 18 and 19.
For in the first place, when one is together, when you come together as a church, I hear that division is among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you.
You know that passage was there? Paul said sometimes there needs to be division. Sometimes there needs to be, so that the heresies can be separated from the truth. Sometimes that's going to happen. Okay? So the reality is that the prayer, at least that I read in 1 Corinthians 1, has to do, or the plea has to do with us being united, but not united at any cost. Sometimes there are some situations where we're going to have to split. And unfortunately, oftentimes when that happens, the ones who are considered to be the heretics are the ones who left. You know, I stayed, so I'm not a heretic. But I ferreted out the heresy, and they left. And the ones who left said, I can't get along with those heretics, I'm leaving. You know. But the point is that sometimes division has to happen. But again, when I look at this, and what we've been talking about is this denominational thinking, of thinking that there's some way that we could possibly unite the entire universal church and put in place some rules and guidelines that everybody could follow. Now, if you had a few of them, that might not be difficult. I mean, if you all united all the baptized believers on Ephesians 4, one faith, one Lord, one baptism, that would be relatively easy to do. At least easier than having a whole list of 50 things that you can or can't do, right? All right? So the point is that even among us, and this is an illustration I want to give you this morning, even among us, and I don't know if when I say us, I'm talking about churches of Christ in general. I don't know for a fact that anybody here is going to believe or believes what I'm just going to illustrate for you. But I'm going to give you an illustration that actually did happen right here in this congregation a few years ago. And I'd be interested to know what your reaction is to this. But my point is that among us do think denominationally, whether we like it or not, and we'll say we're not denominational, we're not a denomination, we don't think that way. I know for a fact that some of us do. And here's my illustration. A few years ago, I was teaching a class locally, or teaching a class for my mold training, and I had 3 folks come in from out of state who are trainers. We were doing some training with them. One of them is a baptized believer. She doesn't go to a Church of Christ, but she's a baptized believer. The other 2 would consider themselves Christian. All 3 of them extremely committed to the Lord. I mean, all 3 of them, their lives were just exemplary in terms of their commitment to what they believed was correct. So as I normally do, I invited them to services, and they came to services with us on a Sunday morning. That Sunday morning, the preacher was out of town, and so one of the members gave a sermon, which we often do. The sermon that he gave was based on the narrow way versus the broad gate where everyone is going to go into destruction. The point that he made in the sermon was this quote. Now let me just tell you this, his background was the same as mine. Came from the non-institutional, more conservative Church of Christ wing of the Churches of Christ. Can I say it that way? Came from the non-institutional Churches of Christ. That's where I came from, that's where he came from. So he read this quote, "This fellowship of non-institutional congregations which intentionally forgoes any para-congregational organizational structure is estimated at about 120,000 members, accounting for around 9% of the members of the Church of Christ in the United States, and for about 15% of Church of Christ congregations." So he read that quote. Non-institutional members accounting for about 120,000 members, only 9%, small segment of all of the Churches of Christ. And he made the point that isn't it sad that those are the only people that are going to heaven? That's how narrow the gate is. So I'm sitting there going, okay. I go off to dinner, and we're sitting at dinner, and one of the ladies says, "So, Doug, do you believe the same thing that your preacher believes about who's going to heaven? That only Churches of Christ, only people in the Church of Christ are going to heaven?" And I took a deep breath, and the lady across the way the other lady said to this lady, "Oh, no, that's not what it meant. Couldn't possibly be what he meant." And she said, "No, that's exactly what he meant." Because I went up to him after the class, after the sermon, and asked him, is that what you meant? Only those 120,000 are going to heaven. And he said, yes. So it opened up an interesting discussion. Very briefly, I told him no, I didn't believe that. And we talked about baptized believers and, as much as you can do over your hamburger that you now don't feel like eating. But my point is that is the thinking of some people in our community. That is the thinking of some of our people in the community. And that's, to my way of thinking, that's denominational thinking. That's thinking that there is some specific group that somehow I can put my arms around and I can say, these are the people who God accepts.
That example just gave, excuse me. Part of one of the things that, for a short period of time in my youth, actually drove me away from the church for a while. Mm-hmm. I think that affects a lot of members that way when somebody expresses that exact.
Yeah.
So I had to come to it within myself.
And I don't think I've ever I don't think I've ever heard it stated as clearly as he stated it. But I think sometimes it is there, and sometimes it comes across like that, even if it's unintended. It comes across that way. Yeah, Larry?
I was raised in the church. Remember, all the old guys that you need a lesson, that's what they say, that the sinners in the Church of Christ will be saved. I don't believe that. And I go back to Matthew 7:21, and where Jesus said that not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, shall be saved, but he will. So if somebody asks me, as soon as they find out I go to the Church of Christ, they say, oh, you believe you're the only ones that going to be saved. And invariably, and I always say, no. I said, I believe those who do the will of the Father will be saved.
Yeah.
And I give them that, I said, read Matthew 7.
I think that's the right answer, Larry. We don't know who God has relationship with.
No.
I don't even know in this congregation who God has relationship with. Pretty confident about myself, but we just don't know. And certainly when you start backing away and looking at it corporately, as we've tried to discourage our doing, you look at corporately, it's really hard, impossible to figure all of that out. And so again, bringing us back to our focus, what the really important thing is for us to think about what it is that we're doing here and how is it we can help each other be what we ought to be. That's the real goal. I can tell you that's Mark and my goal. We're not interested in what's going on in the other churches. I used to be, I'll tell you, I used to read all the papers. I used to, but anyway, my thinking is significantly different now. All right, so.
Before we move on.
Sure.
So this is a really difficult balancing act, right? It's
It is.
Concept of, it is. The way is the error. And it's very clear that it's an error.
It is.
Because God doesn't talk about 5 different books of life.
Exactly.
He talks about one.
Yep.
Right? Over and over and over. He did your name
Right.
by the end of the earth.
Right.
But it's a concept of us being somehow wise enough to discern who is and who is not God. Should be immediately thrown out if we just go to Hebrews 11. And we look at the people that are listed in the chapter of faith and we find Rahab.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We find Jephthah.
Yeah.
He killed his daughter.
Right.
On an oath to God. We find Samson. And that should immediately tell us that whatever wisdom we think we believe we have that can define who are those who are God and who are not should immediately be thrown out.
Yeah.
But we should not deny the fact that there's a clear roadmap of consistent truths and that those who are called will all belong to God.
Yeah.
Right?
Amen. They're all the same church. There's only one.
That's right.
They're all the same church. Yeah, it's just the problem is when we get out trying to think that we can define it in some way beyond what the way the scriptures define it. And that's what I've been talking about, is this idea of thinking corporately. So let me just say this too, parenthetically. If you don't know, we've been studying this now for 4 weeks. We've got 4 different lessons that we've done. If you want to go back and look at those, we've actually now, the audio files are posted on the website. We've actually merged them to the PowerPoints, so they're in video format. So if you want to go back and you have any questions, you want to kind of study some of this, feel free to go back and do that. Because I don't want to spend a lot of time covering ground we've already covered, but I want us to all be on the same, on the same page and moving in the same direction. And I really think we are. So we looked at this, and what I did was I took this chart and I said, this is a little confusing, so we're going to do it this way. And we went through this timeline, and this is where we ended last week. We went through this timeline and showed how the Roman Catholic Church broke away, actually kind of formalized in 300 AD. From that came the Great Schism, which was the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church. And then Luther, of course, in 1517, came out of the Catholic Church. He was a monk and came out of the Catholic Church with the 95 Theses and came down. Calvin said you didn't go far enough, you need to go further than that. And all of these different denominations, and these are just a few of them, but all of these different denominations came from somewhere. That's the point that I wanted to make on this. And the takeaways that we took last week at the end of the class was that in most cases there was this stark contrast between a performance religion and a grace religion. And I made the point last week that where the Roman Catholic Church had been built primarily on a performance-based religion, primarily, Luther, because he was protesting that, went to the other extreme. And Calvin actually codified that and made it even stronger, that it's only about faith. It's only about grace. And so what you see, interestingly enough, is a lot of these different denominations will go one way or the other. And isn't the reality, isn't the truth that it's both? We've got to have, we're saved by grace, through faith. We're also saved by obeying God. Those two things go together. And that's kind of unique among the religious world today, frankly, because of the way this thing broke out. The other thing we talked about was Bible authority versus church authority. We said early on in the Roman Catholic Church, they had three different levels of authority. It was the Pope, traditions, and the Bible. Those were the three things that determined what was right. And if there was, you probably already know this, but if there was some disagreement over what the Bible said, who made the ultimate decision? The Pope. That was the main authority. Well, Luther, fighting against that, protesting against the Catholic Church, guess what he did? He went to exactly the opposite extreme. And he said, it's only the Bible. It's only the Bible. I want you to hear that for a second. We're not the only ones that have said it's only the Bible. There have been a lot of people who said it's only the Bible. It's only the Bible. The problem is, what do you mean by that? When you look at the Bible, how do you determine, which we did January, February, we were talking about command, inference, necessary examples. The question is, we agree it's only the Bible, but how do you interpret that? And that's created, as we'll see in the Restoration movement, some issues. So this idea of thinking corporately, a lot of the people that broke away, even though it wasn't intended, Lutheran did not start the Lutheran Church. Those who followed him created the Lutheran Church. I don't think that was ever his intention, but that's what happened. And they picked a name, and that's what they decided they were going to be. And that's what happened with most of these. So it wasn't necessarily the people themselves that promoted that, although Henry VIII was an exception. He said, we're going to start the Church of England. And so he denominated and created his own church. At the same time, which you don't see up here, there's a whole lot of history up here that you don't see, but the Church of Scotland was started. There were a whole bunch of other churches that were started around the same time for a lot of different reasons. They had to have a creed, something that they all agreed on universally, which is my point about denominational thinking, that there's got to be a creed that everybody can agree to, and everybody follows that creed, written or not, but that there's some sort of creed, and that it has to have some sort of universal structure. So, and that's what's happened with most all of these different churches. So, I want to look at this for a second. I'll tell you what I did, and you may disagree with that, and that's okay too, but I'm teaching. I told you when we first looked at this chart that one of the things that I had issue with was this at the top, the individuals who are part of the remnant. And most charts that you look at like this have that kind of thing, where you see the faithful at the top, and everybody else is dropping off of the faithful. And then they see the Restoration movement as an attempt to get back to being in that group in the remnant. I think that chart is denominational, because that's not how I see the remnant. So let me suggest something. So you see what happened right here? You see the Restoration movement? You're all trying to get back to and then they break away again. So what I did was I changed this chart and I put at the top of it a timeline, because I think a timeline helps us a little better understand what's going on. So here's my question for you. So where is the remnant? There's always been a remnant. Everybody agree with that? There have always been baptized believers. Even when there was a period of time when the Catholic Church was the church, it was Christianity as far as the world saw it. It was the church. And they killed people who didn't agree with them. But even during that period of time, there was always a remnant of people somewhere who was faithful to the Lord. Now, I doubt that they knew each other much. I mean, some in Africa, some in Australia, some in the United States. So, if you were putting on this chart, where would you put the remnant?
Scattered amongst all of them.
Everybody agree? Scattered among all of them? Scattered somewhere? There's the baptized believers somewhere. You guys read my notes. I must be right. That's great. So this is what I did. That's where the baptized believers are, all over the place. Now don't look at one dot and say, there can't possibly be somebody in it. It's not the point of that. The point of this is that in regards to the remnant, in regards to the faithful, it was not a corporate thing, it was an individual thing. You with me? It was an individual thing. It was people being faithful to the Lord, and that could have meant a lot of different things. It could have meant that they did know each other and they were able to work together in a local group. It might mean that they didn't know anybody that was faithful to the Lord and they met in their house. It could have meant a lot of different things. We don't know. That's why they call it the Dark Ages. We don't know anything about that. But I'm convinced that what was happening back then and all through history, through religiously, has been people who have been faithful to the Lord. And of course, that's what I want to be. So, for instance, the 7 churches we're talking about, where's the church at Laodicea today? Where's the church? I mean, you read all those 7 churches, I don't know where any of them are. Any of them. I mean, they were in cities somewhere, but there's not a Church of Christ in Thyatira building saying, here's, we have our source, our founded in 33 AD. You don't see that. Where's the Church of Corinth? It was a huge church, apparently. I don't know exactly how they were structured, but it was a lot of people. So turn over to Colossians 1. And somebody read for me verse 23.
It is we to continue in faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, for which I, Paul, became a minister.
Yeah, do you believe that? That the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven? Do you believe that? Yeah. You want to say maybe, maybe not? I want to say I believe it. I want to say I believe it. That there was a period of time when the gospel had been preached to every creature on earth. Now, I can equivocate on that and back away, well, maybe it's figurative. But let me show you what actually happened. In Acts chapter 8, Saul approved of the execution of Stephen, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. Acts 8:4. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Acts 11:19. Now those who were scattered because of persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. James 1:1. This is the letter addressed in James. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. You know what that means? Yeah, the word is diaspora. It's the idea they were scattered all over the place. 1 Peter 1:1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. They were scattered all over the place. So I got a question for you. We know where Peter went. We have a little bit of information about him. We've got a pretty good feel for what happened to Paul. Those guys, we learn a lot from Acts about where they went. Where did the rest of the apostles go? I think they went all over the world teaching the gospel. That's my personal opinion. I can't prove that. But so that when you get to a passage like 1 Corinthians 23, I just don't doubt that. I really don't. I have a very strong feeling that the gospel had been preached all over the world. Now, it eventually stopped being preached. Why? Because people stopped preaching it. If we stopped preaching the gospel right here and closed our doors, then it's not going to get preached. Our kids aren't going to learn it. Our grandkids aren't going to learn it unless someone else comes in their life, right? The reality is that that's how the gospel gets spread. It doesn't get spread by some national corporate universal effort. It gets spread by me teaching someone, by you teaching someone. Eve and I were talking about this morning a little bit, and the illustration that she reminded me of, which is so true, is multi-level marketing. Y'all know about Amway? I don't know for sure, but I doubt there are very many people that call Amway and say, I want to be a distributor. Maybe some, but most of it is because there are people out there recruiting, promoting. I think the same thing happened with the gospel. Okay, so with that foundation, we're ready to move into this discussion and talk about the Restoration Movement. What happened, there was a huge, in this period of time, late 1700s to the early 1800s, there was a lot of discontent with the church situation. What people were seeing, a lot of people were saying, this happened all over the world. This did not happen in fact, it wasn't the American Restoration Movement, by the way. The Restoration Movement was happening all over the world. It's just that what we know most about is the American Restoration Movement because of Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone. Alexander Campbell, I told Neva this morning, so I think I'm going to use it now. Alexander Campbell was very wealthy. He was extremely wealthy, and so it was easy for him to get his writings out. He was also very smart, but he was very wealthy. And somebody said he found the secret to wealth. So if you're a young guy, here's the secret to wealth. He married a wealthy woman. So he was incredibly wealthy, and so because of the influence of Campbell and Stone, it appears as though those were the driving force, in a lot of ways they were, of the Restoration Movement, at least in America. But there were people all over the world that were frustrated with this denominationalism that they're seeing. And so my frustration is common. I think the frustration that you might feel about all of these different churches, and it's kind of a natural common feeling. Let's get back to the scriptures. And there were a lot of people who said, let's get back to the scriptures. A lot of reformers. First one was actually John O'Kelly. He founded actually the Republican Methodists in 1794, which emphasized the Bible as the supreme authority and the equality of all believers. Eventually, that became the Christian church. We call the Christian church. That was John O'Kelly. He came out of, as you can see, the Methodist church. So he was a Methodist preacher, very denominational in his thinking about structure and all those sorts of things we've been talking about, corporate thinker. Abner Jones in 1801, Abner Jones in 1801 brought independent Christian church ideas to New England in the early 1800s, left to become a Universalist, joined forces with Elias Smith in 1812, establishing congregations, each calling themselves Christians. I don't know if you ever heard of him, Abner Jones and Elias Smith, but very influential in the Restoration movement in the early days, had a lot of influence over some of the Campbells because of his writings. But the point is that he was a free thinker, a reformer, wanted to fix things. And he and Elias both came out of the Baptist denomination. Then you've got Alexander Campbell, which you probably know, Thomas and Alexander. Thomas was the father, Alexander was the son. He was the one who argued for immersion but allowed sprinkling and infant baptism because he considered it an opinion. I bet you didn't know that. They were both sprinkled. And he was okay with that for a really long time. In fact, it wasn't until Alexander wrote his book on, or his heavy writings on baptism, that he finally switched and said, immersion is really the way to do it. And yet there was still allowances in this community for people who would be immersed. I don't know if you knew that. But it was not a source, at least early on, as a reason to divide early on. And he liked the word disciples. When they had this discussion about the name, he liked the word disciples rather than Christian, because Christian had been stolen by the Roman Catholics, the way he viewed it. It was already appropriated, so he didn't like that term. He preferred disciples. And eventually that movement became Disciples of Christ, which we'll look at later. Barton W. Stone, by the way, he came out of the Baptist church. Barton W. Stone was a Presbyterian minister. He got fed up with the denominations as a Presbyterian, formed a separate group of independent Christian church leaders who used the name Christian. By the way, Thomas and Alexander had a little debate about this. Thomas, the dad, liked Christian. Alexander, the son, preferred disciples. So they had those debates. What should we be called? His camp meetings led to, eventually, the Pentecostal movement. I don't know if you knew that, but that came out of this restoration movement, Pentecostal movement. So according to Ed Harold, by the way, if you've not read any of Ed Harold's books, I want to recommend him to you. He's a historian. Ed Harold was a historian, a teacher of history at several universities. He's written several books. He says that by the end of the 1900s, the more conservative elements split from the disciples movement and took the name Church of Christ. So that in 1906, in the 1906 census, it showed about 1.2 million disciples of Christ, which would have included disciples of Christ, Christian church, all baptized believers that were in this movement. 1.2 million disciples of Christ, and 160,000 churches of Christ, Christians. So there were three groups, all with roots in the Stone Campbell movement, all claiming to have the same goal, get back to the Bible, all trying to shed their denominational roots. I want you to think about that for a second. So these guys, which started in the early 1800s, their goal was to move toward, some sort of united restoration. That's really what they wanted, and that's why Stone and Campbell connected. Because they could see that their vision for what a church should be was the same. The only thing they had a few disagreements on immersion, on the name, several little disagreements. But in every case, and I don't know if you know this, but I think this is really important. In every case, they weren't willing to split over those things. they viewed them as matters of opinion. And I think that's important. I'm not saying whether I agree with them, disagree with them. Don't take me wrong, okay? Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm just showing you where they were on this. I got one quote to read and then I'll quit, because I want to show you that the way the movement was characterized was that they sought the unification of all Christians in a single body patterned after the Church of the New Testament. That was really their goal. And my suggestion to you is that I think that's a denominational thinking. I think that's denominational thinking.
Would you read that again?
Yeah. Pioneers of this movement were seeking to reform the church from within and sought the unification of all Christians in a single body patterned after the Church of the New Testament. Now, what you got to do is you got to define all that. What does a Church of the New Testament look like? Which of those elements should I require other people to do? Can I look out there and see this church is part of it, this one's part of it, that one's part of it, this one's not part of it, that one's not part of it? That's the question. We'll explore that some next week.